Hello everyone, Inquisitor Vaughn here, and in today's video I would like to continue with our Primarch Project deep dives by going into the Primarch Project number 14, who would be designated Mortarion. For the list of correspondences for this Primarch Project number 14's designated name would be Mortarion. The aspect of humanity that I assign to the Primarch is Defiance. The specialization of war is chemical warfare, and the Geneseed organ that I most associate with the Primarch and his legion is the Multilung. The 14th Primarch Project crash-landed on a planet called Barbarus. Barbarus was a world that was considered a feral world located in the Segmentum Tempestus. Barbarus circled a dim yellow sun, and the world itself was surrounded by what was called a dark nebula. In its ancient past, when the sun's rays interacted with the surface of the world, a natural chemical reaction occurred during which potent gases were created. These gases would rise into the atmosphere of Barbarus, and over time, this buildup of gases in the atmosphere made it so that the sun's rays could only barely make it through to the planet's surface. The humans who settled on Barbarus had quickly learned that the closer to the surface of the world they were, the better off they would be. The toxic gases rose to the atmosphere, and so anywhere higher than the very lowest levels of the world, the flat moors and the valley basins of the jagged mountains that encircled the planet, were just too toxic for them to breathe in. So the humans lived on the lowest parts of the surface, where the atmosphere was breathable, and figured out an existence. These conditions made advanced civilization impossible, and the people lived in a post-feudal-like state in small villages across the planet. From available information, the people of Barbarus were farmers growing and gathering crops to sustain themselves. One type of crop described in available stories on the world was pale corn. Though it is not elaborated on in any available information, because the toxic atmosphere isn't given any specifically warp-related origin, these toxic gases that built up in Barbarus' atmosphere were likely natural gases that built up over time from their star's interaction with the surface of the world, which we do know had vegetation and plant life. However, the world was said to have a dark nebula around it, and it's unconfirmed as to whether or not the chronicler of the expedition that found Barbarus was talking about the planet's atmosphere or something beyond it. However, as far as what was happening on the surface of Barbarus, it was basically an accelerated 40K version of the greenhouse effect. In the real world, the greenhouse effect is when gases in a planet's atmosphere trap in their star's heat, raising the temperature on said planet. Gases like carbon dioxide, methane, and others increase in percentage in the atmosphere on the planet experiencing the greenhouse effect, which could hypothetically make it harder to breathe. In a sci-fi environment, this could definitely form into a gas and be described as toxic to breathe in. A great example of what the greenhouse effect can do to a planet is Venus. Ironically, if you put a picture of Barbarus and Venus side by side, they look similar. The only difference was Barbarus was actually habitable on its surface. It's just that its atmosphere was toxic to the humans who lived there. Besides the thick and toxic atmosphere of the planet, life on Barbarus would have been simply medieval, even if slightly restricted. However, that would have been the case if not for the Overlords. The Overlords were initially described as a Xenos species which ruled over Barbarus. Unlike the humans who resided on the lower surfaces of Barbarus, the Overlords resided high in the toxic clouds of the world because they were able to breathe it in without experiencing a fatal reaction to it. The Overlords preyed on the human populations of Barbarus, not necessarily to eat them, but to use them. The Overlords had both psychic powers and necromantic abilities. They would use these psychic powers to enslave the humans they would capture, and would use their necromantic abilities to utilize the carcasses of the barbarian humans, forming them into armies of the undead. The Overlords would then use these undead armies to fight wars against each other. It was the Overlords which made Barbarus a hellish place to live on, and the humans of the world huddled around fires at night, hoping that their villages weren't attacked by the Overlords or their minions, which took many horrific forms, from the risen carcasses of people that they already knew, to monstrous entities that towered above the villages with long arms, claws, and long faces contorted into smiles that were called Pale Kings, amongst many others. Not much is known about the Overlords specifically. According to available information, it seems that they used to be human or at one point or something like it before they made a pact with a dark power, which was potentially a power of chaos. Since that pact, they gained the ability to exist within and physically tolerate the toxic heights of Barbarus, gaining their psychic abilities and knowledge of necromancy. Though physically different from the humans of Barbarus, it's not exactly known how they looked. This is a point we'll return to shortly. However, what is known is that the Overlords could, and did, occasionally reproduce with the regular humans of the world. That being the case, it brings to question whether or not they were actually Xenos, or if they were abhumans. I personally lean toward the latter, that the Overlords were abhumans or mutants with psychic abilities, and I think this perspective is supported by information I will share later in the video. The 14th Primarch Project crash landed somewhere slightly above the surface of Barbarus on a field of death. Before he arrived, there had been a large battle between Overlords on a field where the Primarch would later land. When the project landed on the field, it was in the battle's aftermath, and the entire area was covered in mounds of dead and rotting bodies for miles in any direction. I'd like to emphasize that the lore specifically says that it was the 14th Primarch Project that crash landed on the world, not that it was his gestation plot that crash landed. Though not said anywhere officially, I think this suggests that the 14th Primarch Project as a baby crash landed on the planet. Of course, he arrived to the planet in a pod, like all Primarchs did, but so corrosive was the toxic atmosphere of Barbarus that it could have potentially broken down the armored casing of the pod. This is confirmed to be a quality of the upper heights of Barbarus, so it is not a far-fetched theory. Plus, other Primarchs have had tough introductions to their homeworld as well. Remember, Conrad Kurz had to crawl from Nostramo's core, and Ferrus Manus' pod crashed into a mountain. One of the Overlords had been overlooking the battlefield, admiring the mounds of corpses that were the result of the battle's aftermath, when the silence of the area was disrupted by a baby's cries. The Overlord would search for days for the source of this noise before finding the infant form of the 14th Primarch Project. The Overlord, whose name was Necare, contemplated killing the child, but realized that no regular child should be able to breathe where they were. And so, Necare took the Primarch Project as an adoptive child, because he always wanted to have a child but wasn't able to make that a reality. He named the project Mortarion, which meant Child of Death in the Barbarian dialect of High Gothic. Now, the fact that the Overlords spoke High Gothic contributes to the theory that the Overlords were once human at a time rather than Xenos. Another point adding to them once being human is that the High Lord Necare's name is Latin, or at least in the context of 40k, High Gothic, and it means to kill, murder, or suppress. Necare wasn't just one of the Overlords, he was the High Overlord of Barbarus, the ruler of a warring peoples in the heights of a toxic world. Necare would experiment with how high the child could go into the toxic, smog-covered mountains of Barbarus before it would begin to become fatal to it. Then he found that point and he built a fortress for Mortarion there, and then he moved his own fortress to the highest point of the world. Many theories abound as to why he chose to do this. Most revolve around the idea that Necare didn't truly trust Mortarion, him not being the same kind of creature as the Overlords but still being able to survive where they did. Necare would raise Mortarion, coming down from his peak to teach him everything that he needed to know to prepare him to take part in the hellish wars between the Overlord's peoples. Mortarion devoured this knowledge, which ranged from battle doctrine and strategy to necromancy and artifice. Pretty soon, Mortarion learned all that he could about the Overlord's way of life and war, but he became increasingly curious about the subjects that the Overlords used, the humans that existed below, which Mortarion did not understand were humans, learning things from an Overlord's perspective. Little did Necare know that by adopting the child instead of killing him, he doomed his entire species. Mortarion himself fought in the battles of Barbarus for Necare against the other mountain warlords, leading armies of undead and demonic entities, and every time his curiosity about who he was leading grew. It was when Mortarion himself saw some of the Overlords hauling still living human subjects to be transformed and experimented on that he made the decision to journey to the surface of Barbarus. As he descended, Necare had been coming to visit him, and upon seeing Mortarion journey towards the surface, he yelled that Mortarion would not be able to return with the threat of death. Still, Mortarion continued. The environment began to change around him. The air became clearer and less filled with the world's toxic atmosphere than it was in the mountains. He saw the surface of Barbarus for the first time, and he saw humans, living humans, tending to farmland. He smelled human food for the first time and heard human laughter. Something in Mortarion registered that these were his real peoples instead of the overlords of Barbarus. When Mortarion approached the humans of the nearest settlement, they did not trust him at all, but he had patience, working the fields of the farm for them, and with time, the opportunity to show his true alliance would make itself apparent. One of Mortarion's earliest allies and friends amongst the humans during this time was a youth by the name of Callus Typhon. Mortarion and Callus were similar in that they were both outcasts to the human society of Barbarus. Callus's mother conceived Callus after being assaulted by one of the overlords, thus made Callus half human and half overlord. In rage and fear, the village drowned Callus's mother and isolated Callus, treating him like an outsider. Mortarion was raised by the overlords and was also different from regular humans, and so the two became close friends during this time. The reason I mentioned Callus in a video about Mortarion is because this video is as much about Callus as it is about Mortarion. This will be understood more later in the video. The settlement that Mortarion was staying in was attacked by an overlord and its minions. The people couldn't effectively fight back, and so Mortarion joined in the fight against the undead horde, reaping their undead lives with a massive harvesting scythe. The overlord that had been leading the force smiled at Mortarion before it retreated into the poison mists shrouded heights of Barbarus. Mortarion pursued the overlord into the mists, having built a tolerance against the toxic air, and killed the overlord. After this, the villagers trusted Mortarion, and he began to teach them about how to fight against the overlords and their minions, knowing how to from his experience fighting for the overlord Necare. Like a pale, deathly visage of Prometheus, Mortarion brought the stolen fire of knowledge, the knowledge of warfare and self-defense, from settlement to settlement until all of his peoples could effectively defend themselves against the predations of the overlords. Not only this, but Mortarion would create a small army of the strongest, most resilient barbarians from the villages he visited. He would also commission blacksmiths and artisans to create suits of armor which would allow their wearer to ascend into the poison-shrouded mists of the mountains, experimenting with their effectiveness, updating and improving the suits when necessary, to the point that only the highest mountain was inaccessible to them. The highest mountain on the world was, of course, the abode of Necare, the High Overlord. Mortarion would take this army into the poison-shrouded heights of Barbarus and make war against overlord after overlord, butchering each of them and their undead forces. The warriors he led would be called the Death Guard, and it was here that the symbol that would later be adopted as the 14th Legion's heraldry would present itself, at least according to our work, a skull surrounded by a dark halo with 6 points radiating from it. The meaning and origin of this symbol are unknown. However, a theory is that it is the name of the army put into symbolic form, with the skull representing death and the 6-pointed ring around the skull meaning protection in some way. A 6-pointed star is a regular hexagram, and as a symbol it is used in a variety of occult practices in ancient Terran mythology, from a symbol used on talismans of protection to used in ceremonies conjuring spirits. When finally given the opportunity, Mortarion had second thoughts about killing the only father figure he ever knew, and Callus would advise him that he wasn't ready yet and to try again at another time. As Mortarion was returning to his village, he received news that there was a stranger promising hope and a new future. Mortarion grew moody at the news because, committing patricide is a very important part of a young man's life, and Mortarion grew bitter at the thought of someone else stealing the glory of his moment from him. He kicked down the dining hall doors to find the Emperor of Mankind sitting at the head of the table. According to available information, the Emperor challenged Mortarion to climb up to the highest mansion and kill the final Overlord, with the condition that if he couldn't, then Mortarion would submit to the Emperor in complete servitude. Mortarion accepted the challenge and charged up into the mountains. As he got higher, the toxic fog became thicker and thicker. Mortarion climbed further than he ever did before and began to succumb to the environment. He was helmed and in full battle plate, but the pipes on his breathing apparatus of the suit began to erode and decay. Mortarion began to choke and have trouble breathing until finally he collapsed. The last thing that Mortarion saw before his consciousness faded to black was Necare approaching him, intent on killing him and fulfilling the promise he made so long ago, and the Emperor in his golden armor emerging from the fog and killing Necare with his flaming sword. The Emperor brought Mortarion back to safety near the surface. It was after this that Mortarion, following the conditions of the agreement, swore loyalty to the Emperor and was given leadership of the 14th Legion. Before we move forward, let's go over some of the more important aspects of Mortarion's early life. The first thing I want to say is that the theory I mentioned earlier about his gestation pod eroding at the atmosphere of Barbarus is based on the lore that even his suit of armor began to erode and break down on the highest mountains of the world. Though if we are to be specific, it was the pipes of the armor that were beginning to erode due to the environmental pressure. Being that Mortarion's battle plate would be the same plate he would use for the rest of the Horus heresy, the pipes to his suit were either made of copper or bronze. For copper or bronze to erode, many things could happen, but two are low acidity and high pH, which basically confirms my theory that what was happening on Barbarus was a super sci-fi version of the greenhouse effect. Secondly, we don't know how the Overlords of Barbarus looked officially, however, we might have clues. As I said earlier, Callus Typhon was half Overlord and half human, so along with the fact that the Overlord genetics were compatible enough with baseline humanity that the two were able to reproduce and bear offspring, hypothetically speaking, Callus's appearance must also hint at the physiology and appearance of the Overlord, which by itself would not seem too deviant from regular humans. Referring to the theory I've mentioned in previous videos that the Primarch Project involuntarily changed their appearance to match those who would discover them, Mortarion's appearance must also mirror the Overlord's appearance in some way as well. By comparing the visual traits between Mortarion and Callus, we could make theories about how the Overlords looked, such as them possibly having a downward facing or flat noses and strongly built faces. But then again, Mortarion's appearance is interesting as well. Mortarion was described as tall, pale, and thin, and wolf-lean in muscular structure. He was completely hairless, had blank white eyes, and according to artwork of him, his face was wrinkled and wizened. Mortarion was not stereotypically handsome like the other Primarchs. His appearance could have been shaped in imitation, meaning that he began to look more like Necare as time went on. His appearance could have also been his physical response to the environment, with him not developing any hair and his face being wrinkled and skin pale. Another theory is that because Mortarion as a child landed in a field of dead bodies, and those bodies technically being his first physical encounter with humanity, Mortarion could have taken their visage, meaning that Mortarion's death-like appearance is due to the fact that he looks like a dead body. According to artwork, the Legion symbol for the Death Guard was used on Barbarus, so we have a direct origin to the symbol, but what I'm curious about is the armor that Mortarion had made for him and his Death Guard. What was the armor made of? The material seemed to be white or pale in color, and it was trimmed with a dark metal. Mortarion's armor later in the timeline would go on to be the same armor that he would wear during the wars against the Overlords, just updated. So I was curious as to what it was made out of, and it turns out that according to available information, his armor was made of brass and steel. So the white parts of his armor are just white painted steel, which is interesting to know. That would make sense as Barbarus was a feral world that did not have technology to create things like ceramite, so they'd create armor using the materials that they already knew how to make, which included steel, which was likely what they used to make their farming tools. This provides an interesting mental image of the suits created for the Barbarian Death Guard as being heavy slabs of pale steel with copper pipes. If the artwork is anything to go off of, then Mortarion's armor was also interesting for another reason: its slightly beak-shaped helmet, which is extremely similar to the Mark 6 pattern helmet, but probably is a reference to something else, which we will talk about later. As said earlier, Barbarus was a feral world, and feral worlds are known for having very little technology, if any, and their human populations are often extremely superstitious, viewing the world through a lens of ignorance. The peoples of Barbarus considered the Overlords with a degree of superstitious perspective, but they in actuality could be explained with practical explanation. While there were warp shenanigans and necromancy happening amongst the Overlords themselves, they as beings were little more than abhumans given abilities by dark powers. The toxic fog of Barbarus, as far as we know, was a naturally occurring condition on the planet of Barbarus and itself not a manifestation of warp power or demonic origin. Regardless of this, I find myself curious about the past of Barbarus and wanting to make an origin story about how things came to be the way that they were. From this desire, with as much research as possible into the subject, I created this story. When humanity settled on Barbarus initially during the Age of Technology, Barbarus was a much more hospitable place to live on. Let's imagine that the toxic atmosphere was at a time much lower and closer to the surface than it was during the Age of Strife, much thinner and less fatal to the humans on the world. Being that Barbarus was classified as a feral world when it was rediscovered, meaning that it had next to no technology, but knowing that the Overlords had knowledge of artifice, let's imagine that during the Age of Technology, technology did exist on Barbarus to some extent, which helped it to be habitable to the humans there. But that after the Age of Technology, the toxic conditions on Barbarus began to increase over time. Suddenly trapped on an inhospitable world with what little technology that helped them to survive falling into disrepair, the humans on Barbarus began to die by the droves, succumbing to the world's environment. Only the strongest of them survived, and even they only did so barely. In their desperation, they cried out for salvation from their condition, and dark powers answered their call. The dark powers enabled them to survive the toxic environment on Barbarus. These dark powers were theoretically connected to the chaos god Nurgle. But then the environment began to change. The toxic fog lifted from the surface of the world into the heights and atmosphere of the planet. Having been granted the ability to survive in the toxic fog, they also had been tied to its conditions as well. As the fog lifted, so did they, as the Overlords moved from the surface into the mountains, staying in the conditions that they had been given adaptation to. This is not too much of a far-fetched theory, is it not? For is that not the same situation by which the chaos god Nurgle finds more human servants in the 40k universe? Does he not save them from their fatal conditions only to make them vessels for the things that was killing them? Is that not what would eventually happen to the Death Guard Legion as a whole? So we have a situation in which the fog has lifted off the surface and the Overlords rise into the mountains to take part in the necromantic wars against each other. Then more humans began to arrive to Barbarus during the Age of Strife, straggling survivors of the Cybernetic Revolt, regular humans who did not need to adapt to the toxic fog so long as they stayed on the surface. Humans who would become prey to the Overlords so that they can continue playing the great game amongst themselves. It was from these Overlords that Mortarion would learn all that he knew, and those humans on the surface of the world that Mortarion would liberate. The initial recruits to the 14th Legion were taken from the clans of Old Albia, similar to the Night Lords Legion and the Iron Hands Legion. Old Albia had put up a fierce resistance to the Emperor's unification, so much so to the point that the Emperor's forces, we're talking Custodes and Thunder Warriors, couldn't beat them in combat. The Emperor himself had to convince the Albion clan warlords to join him in the unification, describing his vision for the future of humanity and their place in it. He was able to convince them, and they became some of the strongest supporters of the unification. Just a note that when I say they, I meant the clans that would found the Iron Hands and the Death Guard, being that, as we've discussed, the initial recruits for the Night Lords Legion were created from the children found in the underground, interconnected prison sinks beneath Old Albia. The warriors of the 14th Legion were the embodiment of relentlessness. When in battle, they not only held their position under the heaviest fire from the enemy, they unwaveringly marched forward into it, unwilling to surrender or give in. In attack, they strategically destroyed their targets. In both attack and defense, the 14th Legion were known for their use of large infantry formations with which they would overwhelm the enemy forces, and for their attrition style of warfare, which dealt as much casualty to the enemy as it did to themselves. They were endurance fighters, attrition fighters, and this might have been stemmed from their cultural history as a human techno-barbarian nation state during the Age of Strife. The 14th Legion were called the Dusk Raiders by the enemy they fought because of their frequent use of attacking at dusk, when the approaching darkness of night would confuse the enemy's watch. As the shadow of the setting sun crept its way across the territory, the 14th would march under its shroud. So frequently did they use this tactic that the coming of night would cause fear and dread expectation in the enemy. For the human enemies that the 14th were tasked to fight, many were given ultimatums for surrender. The Legion had gained such a reputation for relentless attack by this time that many forces would surrender to them before any conflict was had, and the 14th would honor their surrender, so long as those surrendering were human. Xenos and otherwise were annihilated. The color of the Legion's armor would be a mostly dull gray, which was shared by many in the Emperor's legions during the late Unification Wars. However, the 14th would color the trim of their armor gold and the right arms of their armor a deep blood red, which represented the red right hand of the Emperor of Mankind and his justice. The red right hand also had historical significance as well, in that it used to represent the reach of Old Albia's previous leader while they were a powerful nation state. The Legion's heraldry was initially a fanged skull backed by a black sun, and would later change to a black half-skull, half-sun insignia on a field of red. As the wars for unification spread from Terra into the Sol system, the 14th Legion served without a Primarch during most of the early Crusade, and unlike other legions whose morale was made low by this had shaped the 14th to be a proud and independent legion, not needing their patriarch to be efficient warriors. However, when the Legion was reunited with its Primarch, it was not a joyous occasion, primarily because it was the death of one identity and the life of another. Mortarion appeared before them in dark robes, carrying the black scythe of Necare the Overlord, looking like the visage of death itself. In that first meeting, Mortarion declared the Legion to be his unbroken blades by which death would stalk 1,000 worlds. He declared the Legion name to be the Death Guard, which was the name he had given to the human warriors who had fought the Overlords with him on Barbarus. With that simple statement, but also with the changes to the Legion that he would make afterwards, the Dusk Raiders would cease to exist, their history and achievements slowly forgotten, and this caused issues within the 14th Legion between the Terran-born and Barbarus-born Death Guard. Mortarion initiated a variety of changes to his Legion to truly make it his own. He changed the Legion's symbol into the Death Guard symbol of Barbarus. The color scheme of the Legion's armor was to become a bone white color with green pauldrons and gold or bronze trim. Aesthetically, elements of the Barbaran armor that had been designed during the wars against the Overlords began to express through the Legion's armor as well, such as exposed piping in the armor, spikes on the helmets, and a knight-like face guard. Mortarion also ceased recruiting from Terra and began recruiting exclusively from Barbarus. And the first batch of recruits to the Legion from Barbarus was Callus Typhon, who survived the induction process and rose to be the first captain of the new Death Guard Legion. Over time, the number of Terran-born Marines in the Legion dwindled to extremely low numbers. Though the Death Guard would bring many worlds into compliance and have tithe over hundreds of human populations across the galaxy, Primarch Project number 14 would still choose to exclusively recruit from Barbarus, to the point that after a while, Barbarus became a factory of sorts for producing recruits to the Legion. Despite the arrival of the Imperium of Man and the onset of new technology made available to the world, little was done to make the environment less toxic to its inhabitants. In fact, it's believed the Mortarion saw the environment as an important factor as to what made the Barbaran people and the Astartes of his legion strong, similar to how Pharismanus viewed Medusa and its culture as an important part of what made his legion strong. Strength and endurance became the focus of the Legion. Mortarion's Geneseed already made the Astartes imbued with it physically strong and tough, but he would push this to its limits. Having his Legion recruit exclusively from the toxic atmosphered world of Barbarus was just one way he did so. Another way he did so was by having the Astartes of his Legion ingest poisons and toxins as a kind of Legion tradition. Astartes have organs that prevent them from succumbing to such an act, but Mortarion's traditions would push these organs into hyperdrive, making them particularly strong in the Death Guard Legion, especially as the Geneseed would be imbued into new recruits. The armor on certain Astartes and whole units would incorporate sensors filled with smoldering toxins, or would incorporate exhausts that would release toxic gases into the air around them. The physical toughness mixed with their repeated intentional exposure to poisons and chemicals made the Legion the ideal candidates for war zones that were extremely dangerous even by the standard of Astartes. Where there were poisonous worlds or toxic war zones, the Death Guard would be deployed, physically toughened by their own world and traditions, disciplined and unrelenting by their own nature, to crush the enemy and arise victorious. Primarch Project number 14 did incorporate the Legion structure from the Principia Bellicosa, like all Primarchs would have to do, but in regards to command structure, he simplified it, and in regards to use of symbols of rank and accomplishment, he almost completely removed. The Death Guard were made to be a very basic but efficient and direct Legion. This simplicity made it so that everyone knew their role, everyone knew who was next in line of command, everyone knew what they were supposed to be doing and expected to do at all times. Though the Legion had very few specialized units outside of the structure dictated by the Bellicosa, they did have two units that were deviated only slightly. One was the Death Shroud Terminator Squad, which was basically Mortarion's bodyguard that accompanied him personally and were selected from the strongest of his Legion. The second unit was the Grave Warden Terminator Squad, which only counts as a deviation from the Legion structure based on a technicality. Technically, the Grave Wardens are destroyers, or a destroyer unit in Terminator armor, and that they were armed with weapons that were used by destroyers. Destroyers were a designated unit type in the Astartes legions, which were committed to using forbidden or hazardous weapons against the enemy, which caused death to the enemy and to the Astartes wielding them in a lot of cases. This included radioactive weapons, phosphex weapons, certain plasma weapons, etc. We're going to go over details of the weapons that they would use later in the video. The Grave Wardens were initially what the first company of the Death Guard were called, the units under Callus Typhon, but eventually they would become a designated unit type within the 14th Legion as a whole. They would carry assault grenade launchers with toxin-based ammunition, and their cataphracti armor would project poisonous vapors into the air around them, making it so that even their presence on the battlefield spelt death to the enemy. Weapons inspired by tools of old Barbarus began to be used as symbols of command by the Legion. For example, the scythe, a tool used on the farms of Barbarus, began to be used as a tool of war, upgraded into power scythes carried by commanders and veteran units. Mortarion's own scythe was upgraded as well. I want to elaborate upon something that I don't see elaborated on a lot, and it's that Mortarion's scythe, which he called Silence, was the same scythe that the Overlord Necare wielded. If we are to go off of artwork, Mortarion had the scythe as he was climbing up the mountain to kill Necare. The scythe was, theoretically, the same scythe that he used to kill the first Overlord that attacked the village he was in. If this is the case, Necare, theoretically, gave Mortarion his weapon Silence during his time in the mountains. He would take the weapon with him to the surface, have it upgraded, and would attempt to use the weapon to kill the being who gave it to him. The Death Guard's specialization of war became that of chemical warfare. They were given the ability to use forbidden technology and war crime level weaponry in battle, quite similar to the First Legion, the Angels of Death, or the Dark Angels. However, unlike the First Legion, they also created their own. The 14th Legion used rad weapons, which were the 30k equivalent of atomic weapons in the form of grenades and mortar shells. They used phosphor-based weapons, which utilized phosphex. Phosphex is a rare inflammable substance that expanded on contact with air and became a creeping gaseous flame which spread from where it was deployed and was attracted to movement. Phosphex fire ate into metal and flesh and could not be extinguished except for by exposure to the void of space. The Legion also used what was called alchemical munitions, replacing the promethium in their flamers with it, the contents of grenades and explosive shells with it, and even coating their blades with it as well. In regards to what it was exactly, or what alchemical munitions were, it's not specified. It was unique to the Legion and made by them. The word alchemical is a word used a lot in 30k and 40k, not only with the Death Guard, but with the creation of Astartes and Custodes and even Primarchs. As we've went over in the Primarch deep dive video, due to things in the far future being mystified to a certain degree, words like alchemy don't really refer to any mystical art, but to organic chemistry. So in regards to what the nature of alchemical munitions were, I think that they were chemical weapons specifically used to be lethal to organic life. With the Death Guard, they would often take a liquid form. During the Great Crusade, each legion would develop a specific focus under the leadership of their Primarch. Mortarion's focus was the destruction of tyrants because he believed that humanity had a right to exist without subjugation or fear of subjugation. These beliefs were clearly influenced by his upbringing on Barbarus after realizing that the humans of the world who were being preyed upon by the Overlords were his actual peoples, and on the war against the Overlords. In this, Mortarion led the Death Guard in dethroning tyrannical rule throughout the galaxy. Primarch Project 14 held back nothing and led the Legion across the stars as a scythe would cut through a harvest. The Death Guard didn't build, they didn't create, they didn't rule. They destroyed and slaughtered before moving on to the next campaign, resupplying on the move, never ceasing with a fervor that the Great Crusade had never known. Over time, the Death Guard began to be proud of their physical toughness, their barbarian heritage, and the practices of the Legion, which emphasized both. Similar to the Iron Hands Legion, they began to have a disdain toward physical weakness and would look down upon those who were too weak to protect themselves. Some would say that this was the first seed of heresy in the Legion, but in truth, the seed had been planted the moment Mortarion failed to kill Necare on Barbarus, because it was in that moment that he was forced to submit to the Emperor. Despite the 14th Legion's effectiveness, similar to the 4th Legion, the Emperor largely ignored them and their Primarch. Their victories were not given the same acknowledgement as certain others. This is why we don't know a lot of the conflicts the Legion fought during the Great Crusade after they were reunited with their Primarch Mortarion, and theories abound as to why. I think it was because the style of warfare that the Death Guard specialized in was way too similar to the destruction wrought during the Age of Strife on Terra. The same thing could hypothetically be said for the Angels of Death or the Dark Angels Legion, but the First Legion were monster and Xenos killers primarily. The world-breaking weaponry that they had access to were most often pointed toward enemies other than humanity. The Death Guard Legion turned atrocious weapons on humans and non-humans alike at a far higher frequency across the galaxy. The Dark Angels were some of the purest and most stable Astartes legions, which recruited from humans across the galaxy. The Death Guard were a legion of pale and possibly mutated or abhumanous Astartes that recruited exclusively from their toxic atmosphere world of Barbarus. In truth, Mortarion was closer to the Primarch Project Horus Lupercal than he was to the Emperor, because Horus acknowledged him and his usefulness and his accomplishments. This closeness between the two Primarchs was remarked by others. Many of them had treated Mortarion like a freak. Some, like Ferrus Manus and Conrad Kurz, respected him. It was Rabute Gilliman who brought to the Emperor's attention that it seemed as though Mortarion was more loyal to Horus than he was to the Emperor. The Emperor would brush this off, saying that loyalty to Horus was loyalty to him. In this, the Emperor would be wrong. There was another aspect to Mortarion that showed itself during the Great Crusade, and it was his hatred of psychers and psychic powers. As a youth on Barbarus, Mortarion saw the Overlords of Barbarus use psychic powers to perform necromancy on the dead bodies of humans, reanimating them to use as soldiers in their wars with each other, and he also saw the Overlords summon creatures using sorcery as well. Seeing psychic power as one of the tools that the Overlords used to subjugate humanity on his homeworld, Mortarion quickly grew an aversion to it and saw it as a weapon that could be used to subjugate humanity across the stars. During the Council of Necare, Mortarion expressed that he was adamantly against the legions using psychers because of the dangers of doing so, dangers he saw with his own eyes and experienced in his own youth. It's said that Mortarion was pleased when the Emperor decided against their use in the legions, but this would be short-lived. As Horus Lupercal descended down the path of heresy after himself being corrupted by the powers of chaos, he would convince Mortarion to join his cause. How he did so was convincing Mortarion of three things. 1. That the Emperor was a psyker. 2. That the Emperor bargained with the powers of chaos to create the Primarch Projects. And 3. That the Emperor was a tyrant, no different than the Overlord of Barbarus, or than any of the tyrants that Mortarion and his legion had dethroned across the galaxy. This changed a lot within Mortarion. Horus knew Mortarion's true emotions about the Emperor and the situation of his fealty to him, and decided to use that to convince Mortarion to his side. Mortarion didn't want to submit to the Emperor when they first met on Barbarus. He almost died so that he wouldn't have to, but not only did he fail in doing so, but the Emperor stole his kill. The Emperor killed Necare, and in doing so, subjugated Mortarion to his rule. Despite swearing loyalty to the Emperor, that failure and disrespect festered in Mortarion's heart. Rightfully so, since the Emperor set up a trial in which would basically force Mortarion to submit to him. It could have been done any other way, but the Emperor chose the way that would show Mortarion how weak he was. The information on the Emperor being a psyker also enraged the Primarch, and though it's not confirmed in any available information, Mortarion himself being a Primarch Project and finding out that he was made in part due to a bargain with dark powers must have invoked an identity crisis in him. The very thing he was against was the thing that he was made of and made by. I would imagine that things began to dawn on him. He began to realize what others had realized about him, and his mysterious ability to emerge from shadows without anyone ever noticing him until he strode forth from them. I'd imagine that he began to remember the voice in his head, offering him the truth of how to beat death, as his consciousness faded to black on the highest peak of Barbarus during his attempt to kill Necare. These emotions and this information concluded in the third point that Horus stated to Mortarion, that the Emperor himself was a tyrant no different than the Overlord of Barbarus. Mortarion would join Horus in heresy, and his legion followed loyally behind him. Well, most of his legion, at least. There were still those mostly Terran elements of the Death Guard Legion that were loyal to the Emperor. Mortarion would get rid of them during the scouring of Isstvan III, during which he deployed said loyalist factions of his legion onto Isstvan III alongside the loyalist factions of other traitor legions, namely the Emperor's Children and the World Eaters, and would have Callous Typhon virus bomb the world, killing almost all of the Astartes present in perhaps one of the most heartbreaking scenes in the entire Horus Heresy series. After this, Mortarion and his now traitor Death Guard Legion would take part in the job site massacre of Isfahan 5. The 14th Primarch Project would participate in many other smaller assaults against the Imperium during this time, but the other traitor Primarchs began to resent him. This is because even though Mortarion betrayed the Emperor like the rest of them did, he did not embrace chaos like the rest of them did. Mortarion was alone, even on the traitor side, and he tried to convince Jagatai Khan to join him so that he would not be alone in standing against chaos on the traitor side. Jagatai would refuse, the two would fight, but the conflict would not be concluded due to Mortarion teleporting away. The herald of Mortarion's fall was when he captured and interrogated a woman. This woman was not a regular woman, but a person possessed by a demon. The Emperor taught them that such beings did not exist, and Mortarion was finding out otherwise. He wanted to know as much as possible about them and would interrogate the demon, who would taunt him with his own knowledge. This interaction would conclude with the demon revealing its true form, escaping its confinement, and attacking Mortarion. The demon was impervious to his physical attacks, and so Mortarion had to draw on his own psychic ability that Horus made him aware of. To his own shock, using his innate psychic abilities, he was able to defeat the demon, who, with its dying breath, called Mortarion the Lord of Plague, seeing what he would become in the future. After some time, Mortarion accepted that he too was a psychic being, that he was made using psychic powers by a psychic being, that the warp and warp entities existed. He accepted this new reality, but he did not submit to it. Instead, he committed to learning everything he could about it. The final nail in the coffin of Mortarion's betrayal was hammered in by Callus Typhon. As I said earlier in the video, Callus Typhon was half Overlord and half human. This meant that as a mortal human on Barbarus, Callus Typhon was a Psyker, the abilities he inherited from his Overlord father. As a human on Barbarus, he would experiment with his powers, but with the arrival of Mortarion, the Emperor, and the Imperial Truth, Callus Typhon suppressed his abilities throughout his induction and transformation into an Astartes. He would continue to suppress his psychic powers due to Mortarion's open contempt for psychic ability. But as the Primarch began to lead his legion down the path of heresy, and Mortarion was beginning to realize his own nature as a psychic being, Callus would reveal that he too was a Psyker, but he would do so with malicious intent in his heart. Mortarion had the mind to take part in the Siege of Terra at the climax of the Horus Heresy, but for him to do so he would have to travel through the warp to the Sol System. Prior to this, Callus Typhon had all of the navigators of the Death Guard fleet executed, accusing them all of being loyal to the Emperor. Callus assured Mortarion that he himself would be able to use his own psychic ability to lead the Legion through the warp without the help of navigators. Mortarion trusted Callus Typhon, his oldest friend, and had his fleet enter the warp without navigators. This was a grave mistake. Prior to all of this, Typhon had been inducted into the Brotherhood of the Seven Pillars by the word-bearer Erebus. This brotherhood was essentially a chaos cult amongst the Astartes legions. In it, Callus Typhon saw what could be possible if Astartes shrugged off the trappings of limitations set by the Emperor. He saw the power that they could have. By the time Mortarion had made the decision to head to the Sol System, Callus no longer served his Primarch. He served the Chaos God, Nurgle. I mentioned the Chaos God Nurgle a lot in this video. Who is Nurgle? Nurgle is one of the 4 primary Chaos Gods. He is known as the Lord of Pestilence, the God of Decay. He is the God of Sickness and Death in the Warhammer 40k setting. But he's also the God of Rebirth and the God that is behind the survival instinct. Part of Mortarion's motive is he feeds on the despair of humanity, the despair being the despair of death, the fear of death. And when people are afraid of death due to sickness or due to situations they find themselves in, it is Mortarion that answered. He is the god of plagues, the god of sickness, the god of anything that kills humanity slowly and causes them to agonize. But again, he's also the god of rebirth, meaning rebirth as in being recreated in another form. So when Callus Typhon convinced Mortarion to enter the warp without navigators or Jeller fields, he single-handedly delivered the souls of his entire legion to the Chaos God, Nurgle. What the 14th Legion went through in the warp was literally hell. The Legion was infected with the Destroyer Plague and Nurgle's rot. Their bodies were malformed and twisted, swelling with pestilence and sickness, eyes melting out of their sockets, blood vessels bursting, armor and weapons warping into horrid shapes and being animated with demonic life. The Death Guard were in a state of continual agony, because even though their resilience was pretty much useless against the power of Nurgle, they couldn't simply die because their transhuman physiology kept them alive. Mortarion himself would suffer along with his legion and would attempt to kill some of his marines to end their suffering. It did nothing for the corpses because they were reanimated for the suffering to continue. Time in the warp is different from time in real space, so it isn't truly known how long the Death Guard Legion suffered this fate, but what is known is that it felt like an eternity, and many lost their minds to the agony that they were experiencing. Unable to endure anymore and unwilling to watch his legion suffer anymore, Mortarion cried out for relief from the torture. Nurgle answered the call, as if waiting for him to do so, taking the souls of the Death Guard Legion for himself. When the Death Guard fleet emerged from Terra, they were completely transformed. Mortarion was elevated to Demon Princehood, being transformed by Nurgle, growing in size and sprouting wings, and being imbued with an aura of sickness and death. Callus Typhon was transformed into Typhus, Champion of Chaos, host of the Destroyer Hive, and spreader of the Destroyer Plague. The Death Guard Astartes became Plague Marines, spreaders of Nurgle's pestilence, stuck in a perpetual state of decay and rot. Even the Legion's symbol would change from its once proud heraldry to the three skulls stacked on top of each other. Some believe that this is a replication of the Chaos God Nurgle's symbol, which shows three circles formed into a triangle. This symbol was based on the pattern of boils found on those infected with one of Nurgle's many sicknesses. However, the triangle of skulls may also be originated in the Legion's Destroyer symbol, which featured a trinity of skulls as well, and it would make sense being that the Legion essentially became a legion of destroyers. The Horus heresy would be unsuccessful, and most of the traitor forces would quickly and haphazardly retreat into the Eye of Terror after Horus Lupercal was killed by the Emperor. Mortarion and the Death Guard, however, would conduct an ordered retreat into the Eye, breaking force after force of loyalists that threw themselves at the Legion as it retreated. While Barbarus itself would be cyclone bombed and destroyed by the Dark Angels, in the Eye of Terror, Mortarion would claim a demon world called the Plague Planet, and Nurgle made Mortarion one of his highest demon princes. In the current setting, that's where Mortarion resides, and he launches attacks on the Imperium of Man from the Plague Planet, which he made to be a virtual copy of Barbarus in the Warp, only far more demonic and with him as its overlord. The aspect of humanity that I assign to Mortarion and the 14th Legion is Defiance. Defiance has two definitions: open resistance and bold disobedience, and I think that both characterize the 14th Primarch and his Legion. The Iron Hands, the Night Lords, the Death Guard. Out of the three old Albion-sourced legions created by the Emperor, it can be said that while the Iron Hands would inherit the technological mastery of the Albion clans, and the Night Lords inherited the darkness and sins, the Death Guard inherited the people's defiance. Defiance toward what exactly? Toward subjugation. As a mortal population during the Unification Wars, the Albion clans fiercely resisted the Emperor's forces and his message of unification. This is because to them, the Emperor was just another tyrant, and they had faced tyrants in their past during the Age of Strife. Before the Emperor arrived, Old Albia was ruled by a figure known as the Unspeakable King, a legendary tyrant at the time whose rule was characterized by horror that would be known for generations to come. It's said that he might have been a psychic null or a blank, but it is known that he was served by a host of blanks called the Hollow Ones. The Unspeakable King was a successful ruler. Under his rule, Old Albia held most of the other techno-barbarian nation-states of Terra in their grasp and under their control, and they were even able to defeat and conquer the Pan-Pacific Empire, which was another powerful techno-barbarian nation-state. Shortly after this, though, the Albion clans revolted against the Unspeakable King, who himself escaped the wrath of those who he had subjugated, but whose descendants had been dispatched. After this, the Albion clans were united but free peoples under the rulership of no one being. This is why they fiercely resisted the Emperor, and also why they were so formidable in doing so. It was only through the peaceful means that they were convinced to join the growing Imperium and the Great Crusade. If we go back to my initial theory that the Primarchs were taken from the variety of populations on Terra, then the 14th Primarch Project must have been taken from this group of peoples. The disdain for tyrants and mistrust of psychic individuals would be almost genetically imprinted on the peoples and their consciousness, and it would influence how the Primarch and his legion would develop. The Legion, even before being reunited with their Primarch, would be known for their defiance in its style of war, never relenting to the enemy despite harm and casualty to themselves. When Mortarion landed on Barbarus and was raised by Necare the Overlord, Mortarion would disobey his father figure by descending to the surface and discovering the human population there. He would then defy not only Necare but the environment of Barbarus itself to wage war on the species he had been shaped by during his youth, and he would lead the humans on the world to do so as well by teaching them to create armor and breathing devices that would allow them to climb the mountains and endure the poisonous fog. Mortarion attempted even to defy his own physical limitations by climbing to the highest peak of Barbarus, the abode of Necare, in order to kill the High Overlord when the Emperor challenged him to do so. Something interesting to think about is why the Emperor would challenge some Primarchs and not others. For example, as far as we're told, he wouldn't challenge Dorn or Gilliman, but he would challenge Russ. He wouldn't challenge Lionel Johnson, but he did challenge and physically fight Ferrus Manus. He wouldn't challenge Fulgrim, but he would challenge Vulcan. He wouldn't challenge Jagatai, but he would challenge Mortarion. Why? If it is like what is said in regards to him knowing that Sanguinius wouldn't refuse the offer of fealty due to him knowing Sanguinius' soul, then the Emperor knew the souls of each of his Primarch projects, and that must have been something or had something to do with why he would challenge some and not others. Having been the one who invested canine warbeast genetics into the Primarch project that would later become Leman Russ, perhaps he challenged Russ to see if he could control his bestial nature. After all, before reuniting with his legion, the Terran 6th Legion were predatory and bestial Astartes by nature, and so it was reasonable that he would be unsure of Russ and test him. Perhaps he fought Ferrus Manus to test how willing the Primarch was to submit only to someone strong enough to lead him. Perhaps in testing Vulcan, he was testing how noble his spirit really was. After all, as far as we know, nothing indicates that Vulcan knew of his own perpetual state before meeting the Emperor, and Vulcan could have potentially died during the challenges set forth by the Emperor. These are only theories, of course, but perhaps in regards to Mortarion, the Emperor was testing the Primarch's spirit of defiance. The Emperor more than likely knew that Mortarion's physiology would not be able to withstand the highest peak of Barbarus where Necare resided. Otherwise, why would he meet him up there to dispatch of Necare himself? Why else would he challenge Mortarion to do something that would kill him, if not to see if he would actually do it? More importantly, the condition of the challenge was that if Mortarion couldn't defeat Necare, then he would have to submit to the Emperor in fealty. So not only was the Emperor testing Mortarion's spirit of defiance against the environment of the world and his own physical limitations, but he was also testing Mortarion's spirit of defiance against him, testing that old Albion distrust toward tyrants and subjugation. While theoretically it can be said that the Emperor was proud of Mortarion for even trying to beat the challenge, Mortarion trying at all meant that the Emperor would never truly be able to trust Mortarion. Whereas previous to the challenge, Mortarion hesitated to kill Necare for sentimental reasons, after finding out that the Emperor was his true father and after the challenge, the Primarch was willing to risk death by toxic environment to kill Necare just so that he wouldn't have to submit to the Emperor. That's rather suspicious in a very awkward way. It's like the Emperor wanted him to be defiant, but that's a bit too defiant. The Emperor watched Mortarion nearly die in his attempt, and rather than lose one of his Primarch projects to a challenge he created, the Emperor dispatched of Necare, stealing the kill from Mortarion and bringing Mortarion back to the safer conditions on the surface of the world. It is said that this failure to beat the challenge would affect Mortarion both physically and mentally, and it would scar him in ways that he would never be able to truly heal from. And this is true, because after that, Mortarion committed not only himself, but his entire legion to becoming stronger and tougher. Is this not similar to Ferrus Manus, who, upon not being able to destroy Astaroth as a youth, would commit himself to becoming physically stronger until he was finally able to destroy the biomechanical worm? Ferrus Manus was not able to do so alone and used lava to destroy Astaroth, becoming part machine in the process. Ferrus Manus would also physically fight the Emperor, theoretically of course, if the implications of the Medusan story are to be believed, because he refused to submit to someone who wasn't stronger than him. Mortarion had succeeded in proving his defiant spirit, but failed in proving his strength, and it was this failure that flavored his subjugation to the Emperor. After this, Mortarion would commit to making himself and his legion tougher specifically than both the barbarian environment and tougher generally against the poisonous conditions which almost killed him. That hyper-focus on making himself stronger than what almost killed him is trauma. His failure was why he exclusively recruited from his homeworld, why the toxin-ingesting rituals began in his legion, and why they eventually became specialized in fighting within literally inhospitable war zones that were antithetical to life. His failure was also why he became transfixed with overthrowing tyrants across the galaxy. Defiance as an aspect of humanity is multifaceted, but we can think about it in terms of how Mortarion experienced it: defiance to the environment and defiance to subjugation. Humanity is extremely adaptable to a variety of environments. Our success as a species is credited to that adaptability. A large percentage of that success can be attributed to our intelligence, our ability to create tools and use tools that will help us survive. But the other percentage, which is equally if not more important, is our own physiological ability to adapt to a variety of environments over time. We are such a physically diverse species as a testament to that. For example, in extremely cold environments, we will use tools and wear furs and learn the environment enough to survive in it, but with enough generations, we will also physically adapt to the environment as well. In extremely hot situations, the body will adapt by developing darker complexion to be able to withstand the rays of sunlight and heat. Populations that live in mountains will begin to develop certain traits to be able to inhale more of the thin air, and so on and so on. We adapt to environments, we evolve, and are physically changed by the environments, and in that way, we defy them. We defy environmental conditions we find ourselves in. We defy nature to a degree. Before Mortarion arrived on the world, the humans on the surface found ways to survive in the environment by farming and harvesting crops for food. Despite the hostile condition, they found a way to live on the world. After Mortarion arrived and settled amongst the humans of the world, Mortarion not only guided his people to creating suits of armor that would protect them as they ascended into the mountains to make war against the Overlords, but he would keep the conditions of Barbarus as they were so that the people would continue to experience the environment and become stronger. It's from the people of Barbarus, the people who knew the difficulty of living in the environment that it produced, that he would choose to exclusively recruit from for his legion. Then he encouraged his legion to utilize and ingest poisons and toxins to make themselves stronger so that no hazardous environment would be able to stop them from their goal, which was to be the death of tyrants. That would lead to the second half of the human aspect of Defiance that Mortarion embodied, Defiance against subjugation. Earlier I said that nothing could stop the Death Guard from their goal. Their goal was the defeat of tyrants. The Death Guard served as liberators from oppression across the galaxy. Wherever Mortarion saw a human population under the subjugation of cruel overlords, he and his Death Guard would descend upon them to destroy the rulers, liberating the people and bringing them into the Imperium of Man. Many cultures of humanity have had a long history of killing their rulers when the rulers were deemed unfit to rule for one reason or another. In the face of tyranny, humanity has generally, consistently rebelled and rose up against them. To do so takes defiance. To do so is the act of defiance, and it was the aspect of humanity that I think Mortarion embodied overall. Mortarion would express defiance again by standing against the use of psychers within the Astartes legions, and even though he joined the side of the traitors during the Horus heresy, he would express defiance again by not submitting to the forces of chaos, at least not immediately. Some would say that he didn't show defiance in this regard because he was convinced to join the traitors, but that opinion is from the perspective of a loyalist. Mortarion was told the truth by Horus, regardless of the circumstances that the truth was told to him. The Emperor was a psyker. The Emperor did use warp powers to create the Primarchs. The Emperor was a tyrant, and the Unification Wars are an illustration of that last point. Knowing his upbringing and his story, how could anyone think that he wouldn't stand by his convictions and turn against the Emperor, even if that meant siding with the traitors? And how is turning against the Emperor because of his own personal values not defiance? Mortarion was perhaps the only Primarch besides Perturabo and Curse to turn against the Emperor without supplicating to the forces of chaos. He sought the support of Jagatai Khan so that he would not be alone in being against chaos amongst the traitors. When he found out he had psychic abilities, he demonstrated defiance again by accepting it and attempting to use it rather than submit to it. It was due to Mortarion trusting Callus Typhon, but Callus Typhon being a chaos worshipper, that the Death Guard Legion succumbed to chaos. Many ask if Mortarion would have eventually succumbed to chaos if the warp incident had not occurred, and I think his story speaks for it that he wouldn't. Mortarion consistently found himself having to accept the circumstances he was placed in while standing on his values of being against psychers and tyrants. Standing on these values turned him against the Emperor, who was both these things. It was the Emperor who made him what he was, and he, once aware of it, had to accept it in order to defy it. So he was a psychic being, yes, but he did not have to use his powers like the Overlords did. It did not mean he needed to be a tyrant like them. So to answer the question of whether or not he would have eventually succumbed, the answer is not willingly. He would have tried to find some way to defy. Callus Typhon damned the entire Death Guard Legion. Mortarion, even when he cried out for the agony and the warp to end, did so to end the suffering of his legion, not just himself. He tried mercy killing some of them and they came back. It can be reasonably said that Mortarion defied his circumstances until the very end, and even after the horror that he experienced, a part of him still existed, or at least it existed enough to continue with his goal to attack Terra along with the other traitors. Even in Damnation, he was still against psychers and still against tyrants. If that is not defiance despite environments and subjugation, I don't know what is. I'd like to make another point. In the Ferrus Manus video I made an elaborate point of identifying the themes of the Iron Hands Legion, with their origin being on Old Albia, which is the 40k version of the British Isles, and the theme of the Legion being vaguely connected to the Industrial Revolution. Mortarion's story of landing on a feral world in which humans farmed for a living, suffered from a toxic atmosphere that was the greenhouse effect, superstitious belief, and dark magic, I'd say the themes of the 14th Primarch Project and his legion are based in part on the agricultural revolution. The agricultural revolution, in a general sense, was when humanity transitioned from hunter-gatherer societies into farming and gardening societies. Though it was attributed to a series of changes happening over time, the agricultural revolution is attached to the British Isles, which is what Old Albia was before the age of technology. The agricultural revolution is also a movement of defiance because it was a movement in which humanity stopped depending on what nature provided and began to produce sustenance for themselves. The Legion's much later connection to sickness and pestilence and the chaos god Nurgle is connected thematically to historical events such as the bubonic plague or the Black Death, which killed millions of people and peaked in Europe. The connection to that time period is not one that I made up, but is confirmed in the lore. The chaos god Nurgle himself came into existence during the bubonic plague in the Age of Terra. The reason that Nurgle feeds off of the mortal despair amongst humans is because it's the emotion that brought him into existence during that time. Barbarus and its feral peoples illustrated attitudes and beliefs shown in pre-feudal era during particularly dark times in regards to witches and magic. The fear toward those things, as illustrated in the fact that Typhon's mother was drowned by her village for conceiving a child with an overlord. The fact that the overlords used necromancy, which is why Mortarion hated them so much, and Mortarion's generalized distrust towards psykers. Symbols like the scythe, which connect both to the harvest and to farming, but also to death. Mortarion's beak-like helm was a reference to the time being similar to the plague doctor's mask, and after the Legion fell, one of the symbols of Nurgle's was the fly, which was also a common symbol during that time in history. Though Mortarion's name in the setting means child of death, the real-world source and meanings of his name could include mors, which means death, and the word mortality. The Geneseed organ that I most associate with the 14th Primarch Project and the Death Guard Legion is the Multilung. The Multilung is essentially a third lung that is implanted into an Astartes recruit during their induction into one of the legions, and is attached to their pulmonary system and their circulatory system. The third lung enables an Astartes to breathe by extracting and absorbing oxygen from environments that were too poor in oxygen for a regular human to breathe. In normal environments, Astartes could use all three lungs to full capacity. In toxic environments, the Astartes could close off access to their human lungs, allowing air exclusively into the third lung, which was able to filter out any toxins in the air and extract oxygen from it, so that the Astartes could continue to breathe somewhat normally and perform their duty. The Multilung also enabled the Astartes to breathe underwater because the Marine could close off access to his primary lungs and use his third lung to filter oxygen from the water as if he had gills. Knowing the history of the Legion as the Dusk Raiders and knowing the physical toughness that Mortarion's Geneseed will give his Astartes, it would have been reasonable to assume that the Biscopia would be assigned to the 14th Primarch Project, but that's not the case. Though Mortarion's Geneseed was said to make the Astartes of his Legion hardy and tough, that physical toughness did not come from Mortarion himself, but from the initial human population that it was imbued with. Like all the other Primarchs, the traits that characterized the Primarchs and their legions had their beginnings amongst humanity. As said earlier, the initial recruits to the Death Guard were selected from the techno-barbarian nation-state of Old Albia. The Old Albian peoples were already a warlike and clan-oriented peoples who had overthrown their own tyrant and who had fought against the Emperor. The word Ironside is used to describe them, and because of their use of technology such as proto-dreadnoughts and their ability to fight against Custodes and Thunder Warriors, it could be interpreted literally as them being clad in armor, which they almost certainly were. But another definition to Ironside is to be a person of great endurance and resistance. Used in this way, Ironside is more about the internal quality of the peoples than their external or physical qualities. They were not physically tougher than the Emperor's forces, but they did not give up against them, and that is what made them a people known for being strong, tough, and durable. Following the theory that the Emperor collected the Primarchs from the populations he would conquer, the 14th Primarch Project almost certainly came from these peoples, because the toughness and relentlessness was a foundation of his character. I assigned the Biscopia to Ferrus Manus because he would make it a pursuit to become the strongest that he could be in order to fight the machines of Medusa before the Legion would commit themselves to technological transhumanism. If not for that, I believe that Ferrus Manus would have continued to build his strength. His Legion would have done so as well, to the point that the Legion would have become the physically strongest of the legions. Both Mortarion and Ferrus Manus's legions would be sourced from Old Albia. Both Primarch projects would commit to strength and toughness, but in different ways. Ferrus would commit to physical strength without. Mortarion would commit to physical strength within. The Astartes of the 14th Legion are described repeatedly in their lore as being physically tough, but how? In what way? What was the origin of this toughness? If I am to follow the theory I have been presenting in the series, the abilities of the legions are sourced in the human populations that they were taken from. For example, the hyperactive omophagia organ of the Blood Angels Legion did not come from Sanguinius, but from the initial recruits to the Legion, who were mostly cannibals. The pale skin and black eyes of the Night Lords Legion did not come from Kurz. Kurz himself would not have had pale skin and black eyes if not for adapting to Nostromo. The traits come from the initial recruits to the Night Lords Legion, who were the Night's Children in the underground prison sinks of Terra, ironically sourced from Old Albia. So in regards to the Dusk Raiders' physical toughness, it was likely from the initial Old Albion recruits to the Legion, but specifically, their toughness was oriented around their breathing. In available descriptions, Old Albia was described as containing towering, soot-blackened castrum cities in which the air was polluted with smog from its industrial production. So at the very least, the peoples of Albia were used to breathing in smog-filled air. So during the latter wars of unification and early Great Crusade, the 14th Legion, then known as the Dusk Raiders, were known for their Ironside, tough and relentless nature. However, their physical toughness against certain environmental factors wouldn't be known until later. The 14th Legion's Primarch would land on Barbarus, a world with a toxic atmosphere. And I feel like it's important to point out that the irony that the Primarchs of those legions made initially from Old Albia all landed on worlds with polluted atmospheres. Ferrus Manus on Medusa, whose atmosphere was polluted from the planet's industrial past, Conrad Kurz and Nostromo, whose atmosphere was polluted due to the Hive world's active industrial production, and Mortarion on Barbarus, whose atmosphere was polluted due to the natural processes of the world's surface. Now consider Mortarion's genesis. Mortarion landed on Barbarus, specifically on land that was shrouded in the toxic fog of Barbarus. His first breaths as a child were of toxic air, and it didn't kill him. He would survive, be raised, and would spend his early years in the toxic fog, just under the physical limits of his body. This suggests that Mortarion adapted physically to his environment in these conditions in the same way that all Primarchs adapted to their environments, especially those in extreme environments. Though he was able to survive on the surface of the world and he would need a suit of armor to climb to the highest point of the planet, his default setting, the air that his body has adapted to, was the toxic air. That being considered, is it any mystery why Mortarion's suit of armor, the Barbaran plate, would be modified with pipes and aromatic systems which would constantly emit the toxic air of Barbarus around him? He needed it. It was his default. It made him stable. Theoretically, it is his Terran human Old Albion heritage combined with the gene crafting of the Emperor that gave him his natural ability to breathe in smog-filled and poisonous air without difficulty. And it's this lineage and ability that Ferrus Manus and Conrad Kurz also share. Mind you, Mortarion and Conrad Kurz were also physically strong. Mortarion was described as wolf lean in muscular structure, so he was actually pretty strong as well, but his strength was focused on something else. The people of Barbarus had to have also been used to inhaling some degree of toxic air. While they could not journey into the mountains without the toxic smog killing them, the natural processes of the world would assure that they would inhale a percentage of the toxic atmosphere. When the wind would blow in times of humidity, when it would storm, they would breathe in the atmosphere to varying degrees over time. Therefore, it would not be far-fetched to theorize that they had adapted to it to some degree, physically changing over time in order to survive on the surface of the world. It is also quite possible that the Barbarians could have survived directly in the toxic fog if not for their superstitious belief about it and the nature of the Overlords, who themselves were once regular humans. Mortarion must have believed this as well, because he would cease recruitment from Terran populations and exclusively recruit from Barbarus. Combining the 14th Primarch Project's Geneseed, which had already been imbued with enhanced respiratory strength from his initial subjects, with a population of humans from a world whose atmosphere was toxic, together made the Astartes of the Death Guard Legion amongst the toughest in regards to adverse environmental conditions. Astartes have other organs that make them invulnerable to toxins and poisons. The Preomner, for example, allowed an Astartes to ingest poison or inedible material by neutralizing the toxins from the material. From there, the poison would be isolated and vomited up by the Astartes, or weaponized inside another Geneseed organ called the Betrayal gland, which gave Astartes their poisonous saliva and bite. They also had the oolytic kidney, which was an emergency detoxification organ when an Astartes came into contact with something that their rugged immune system couldn't shake off. All Astartes have these organs, but in the Death Guard, Mortarion would enforce the traditions of purposely ingesting poisons and pushing the limits of these organs to their limit, which contributed to the Legion's notoriety as the toughest and most endurable of all the Legions. The only organ that the Legion did not have to push in any way to show its resilience was the Multilung, which by itself was already strong, and that, along with Mortarion's consistent need for a rebreather, is why I assigned the Multilung to Mortarion and the 14th Legion. With that being said, that was my deep dive into Primarch Project number 14, who would be designated Mortarion. I hope you all enjoyed that, and if you are interested in this kind of content, please like and subscribe and share. Without anything else to say, Inquisitor Vaughn out. Remember, the Emperor protects and the future is successor.